Claire Bennett knew the man behind her had found her before she saw his reflection in the clinic's darkened glass, because the familiar ache beneath her healing ribs suddenly felt like a warning rather than an injury. Boston rain hammered the sidewalk, patients had gone home, and the front desk lights were already off when a message appeared on her phone from a number she had blocked 6 weeks earlier. "You can change your address, but you cannot change what you owe me." Claire stopped beneath the awning, forcing herself to breathe while traffic blurred across the wet street, because answering would prove she was still listening, and ignoring it might invite something worse. She had left Daniel after the night he shoved her into a kitchen counter hard enough to fracture 2 ribs, yet nobody at the community clinic knew why she moved slowly or avoided deep breaths. Before she could decide whether to call the police, a black sport utility vehicle pulled toward the curb, and the stranger stepping from it looked directly past her toward the man waiting beneath the opposite storefront. He was tall enough to make the umbrella in his hand seem small, broad through the shoulders, and composed in a way that did not belong to the chaos around him. His dark overcoat carried no visible logo, but the driver remained behind the wheel with the alert stillness of someone trained to notice exits. Claire followed the stranger's gaze and saw only an empty doorway, because the watcher had already disappeared into the evening crowd. "Do you know him?" the stranger asked, keeping several feet between them. Claire said she had not seen anyone, although her voice betrayed her, and she tried walking toward the subway before dizziness folded the street sideways. He caught her elbow without pulling her closer, steadying her just long enough for her knees to stop trembling. "You are guarding your left side," he said. "Those ribs are not healed, and whoever sent that message expected you to leave alone." Claire jerked her arm away, more frightened by his accuracy than by his presence. "You read my phone?" she demanded, but he shook his head and pointed toward the bright screen still visible in her hand. He introduced himself only as Ethan and asked whether she wanted an ambulance, a police officer, or a ride to a physician whose private office was 3 blocks away. The choices disarmed her, because Daniel had always disguised commands as concern, while this stranger made every option sound genuinely hers. Claire refused the hospital, then tried standing without support, and nearly collapsed again when pain seized beneath her chest. Ethan opened the rear door of the vehicle, but did not touch her, telling her he would close it immediately if she decided to leave. After one humiliating moment of hesitation, Claire climbed inside and kept her bag pressed against her body. The physician's office occupied the first floor of a restored brownstone, with warm lamps, quiet music, and no crowded waiting room where strangers could study her discomfort. Ethan remained outside the examination room while Dr. Miriam Lowe reviewed new imaging and confirmed that Claire's fractures had worsened because she had returned to 14-hour shifts too soon. The doctor also found bruising inconsistent with a simple fall, yet she asked no questions Claire had not invited. Instead, she explained that another impact could cause serious complications and handed Claire a written plan requiring restricted duties, follow-up care, and several days away from work. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity, because unpaid leave meant choosing between rent and recovery. Dr. Lowe glanced toward the closed door and said the medical costs had already been covered anonymously, although Claire could repay them later if accepting help felt uncomfortable. In the waiting room, Claire confronted Ethan before he could stand. She told him money did not purchase access to her life, gratitude, or explanation, and expected the cold irritation powerful men usually revealed when generosity failed to create obedience. Ethan only nodded, then asked the receptionist to prepare an itemized invoice in Claire's name so she could decide what to repay and when. "Help should reduce fear," he said, "not create another debt." During the ride home, he sat across from her rather than beside her and asked nothing about Daniel, the message, or her injuries. Claire finally asked why he had been outside the clinic, and Ethan explained that the building's nonprofit board was considering a funding proposal from one of his foundations. The answer was ordinary enough to be believable, yet his attention had been fixed on the opposite storefront before Claire nearly fell. When she asked what he had seen, he described a man in a gray baseball cap who appeared to be photographing the clinic entrance. Ethan had instructed his driver to note the license plate but had not followed the man because Claire's collapse became more urgent. He offered to send the information to police, and Claire refused instinctively before shame followed the word. Outside her apartment, Ethan placed a plain white card on the seat between them and said the number reached him directly. Claire slipped it into her bag only because throwing it away felt theatrical, then climbed the narrow stairs without looking back. Inside, she locked both deadbolts, checked every window, and placed a chair beneath the door handle before allowing herself to breathe fully. The room remained silent until her phone vibrated again. This time, the message contained a photograph taken through the clinic window less than an hour earlier, showing Claire speaking with Ethan beneath the awning. Beneath the image, Daniel had written a single sentence that changed the meaning of the stranger's arrival. "Ask Ethan Calloway what happened to the last woman he tried to protect." Claire searched Ethan's name before dawn, knowing she should sleep, yet unable to ignore the possibility that she had accepted help from another dangerous man. Newspaper photographs showed him at hospital fundraisers, shipping terminals, court hearings, and memorial services, always standing slightly apart from the people around him. Official profiles described Ethan Calloway as a private investor whose companies controlled freight routes, warehouses, and commercial properties throughout New England. Less careful websites called him a fixer, a man who settled disputes before lawyers reached court, and whose enemies often discovered cooperation was cheaper than resistance. The woman Daniel mentioned appeared after nearly an hour of searching, buried inside an 8-year-old article about a missing financial analyst named Rebecca Shaw. She had worked for one of Ethan's companies, reported threats after discovering accounting fraud, and disappeared 3 days before testifying. Claire called the number on Ethan's card at 6:15 in the morning, prepared to hear an assistant or recording. Ethan answered after the first ring and spoke her name without surprise. "Who was Rebecca Shaw?" Claire asked, refusing every polite beginning she might normally have used. Silence followed, not evasive but heavy, before Ethan asked whether Daniel had contacted her again. Claire read the message aloud and demanded an answer before giving him anything else. Ethan said Rebecca had uncovered embezzlement inside a company he acquired, and he had promised protection while persuading her to testify. He placed security outside her home, but Rebecca dismissed one guard after believing the danger had passed, then vanished before Ethan learned the threat came from someone inside his own organization. "Did you find her?" Claire asked, and Ethan admitted Rebecca's body had been recovered months later from a submerged vehicle outside Providence. The man responsible went to prison, but Ethan had never forgiven himself for confusing expensive protection with genuine safety. Claire expected him to use grief as a reason she should trust him, yet he did the opposite. He warned that Daniel's knowledge of Rebecca meant someone had researched Ethan or received information from people connected to that old case. Ethan offered to send the license plate and photograph to a detective who specialized in stalking cases, but he said Claire would remain the complainant and control every formal decision. She agreed only after insisting that Ethan never place anyone outside her home without telling her. "Protection you cannot see still changes your life," she said. "I need to know what is around me." Detective Maya Torres met Claire at the clinic that afternoon and treated the messages as evidence rather than drama. She documented the injuries, photographed the threatening texts, collected Daniel's full name, and asked whether Claire wanted to pursue a restraining order. Claire hesitated because the last time police came to the apartment, Daniel had convinced them an argument had become mutual, while she stood in the kitchen too frightened to contradict him. Maya explained that past failure did not make the current evidence meaningless, although she refused to promise an outcome she could not control. The gray cab vehicle belonged to a rental company, but surveillance cameras captured its driver using a prepaid phone outside the clinic. Daniel's own car had remained in Connecticut, suggesting he had either hired someone or persuaded a friend to watch Claire. Ethan stayed away for 4 days after the interview, respecting the boundary Claire had established, yet his absence unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She followed her restricted schedule, accepted help from coworkers, and attended a follow-up appointment where Dr. Lowe confirmed the ribs were finally beginning to mend. On Friday, Claire found a paper bag outside her apartment containing groceries she had mentioned needing during the physician visit. Anger rose until she noticed the receipt and a handwritten note from her elderly downstairs neighbor, who said Ethan had paid her to shop, only after asking whether Claire already trusted her. The gesture was thoughtful, but it also revealed how easily his resources could enter ordinary parts of her life. Claire called him and said kindness still required permission. "You are right," Ethan answered without defending himself. He admitted he had worried she would carry groceries despite medical restrictions, and had chosen convenience over consent. Claire expected apology to end the disagreement, yet he asked what repairing the mistake should look like. She told him never to arrange anything involving her home, work, health, or neighbors, unless she requested it directly. Ethan repeated the boundary in his own words, ensuring he understood, then promised to follow it. The conversation should have ended there, but Claire found herself asking whether he had eaten dinner. Ethan laughed softly and admitted he had been working since sunrise. She invited him to a public cafe near the clinic the following Tuesday, emphasizing that it was only coffee and that she would arrive separately. Their meeting felt unexpectedly ordinary. Ethan wore a navy sweater instead of a tailored coat, ordered black coffee, and spoke about growing up with grandparents in Vermont after his father died. Claire told him she became a nurse because her mother had spent years caring for uninsured neighbors from their kitchen table. He did not ask about Daniel, and she appreciated the absence until a silver sedan remained parked across the street through their entire conversation. Ethan noticed it but did not look twice, explaining quietly that his security team had seen the same vehicle near one of his warehouses. When Claire asked whether Daniel could be targeting Ethan through her, he said the sequence suggested something more complicated. Daniel had known about Rebecca before Ethan's name appeared publicly beside Claire, which meant the threat may have begun before the rainy night when they met. As they left the cafe, Claire's phone received an image showing Ethan entering Dr. Lowe's office years earlier beside Rebecca. The accompanying message read, "He tells every frightened woman she still has a choice." Claire looked from the photograph to Ethan, suddenly aware that Daniel possessed details never reported publicly. Before Ethan could answer, a delivery cyclist struck the cafe window with a metal object and sped into traffic, leaving behind a shattered pane and an envelope taped to the glass. Inside was a photocopy of Rebecca's final written statement, with one sentence circled in red. "The person helping me knows where every guard will be." Ethan did not touch the document until Maya arrived, and his refusal to seize control steadied Claire more than any promise could have done. The detective sealed the photocopy, collected nearby security footage, and confirmed that Rebecca's original statement had never been released outside investigators, prosecutors, and Ethan's former security director. That director, Marcus Vale, had disappeared after Rebecca's killer was convicted, although police lacked proof that Marcus had helped plan the crime. Ethan admitted he once believed Marcus had merely ignored warning signs to protect the company's reputation. The circled sentence suggested Rebecca had understood the betrayal before her death, and someone was now using that knowledge to reopen Ethan's guilt while terrifying Claire. Maya warned them that Daniel might be involved without understanding the larger motive. Claire returned to work under a temporary safety plan she helped design, including varied departure times, escorted walks requested rather than imposed, and direct communication with Maya. Ethan did not appear at the clinic, yet he provided business records only after Claire approved their release to police. Investigators discovered that Daniel had worked for 6 months as an independent technology contractor at a Calloway warehouse 2 years earlier. His contract ended after he accessed restricted employee files, but no charges were filed because the company could not prove criminal intent. Marcus had signed Daniel's termination paperwork despite supposedly living overseas at the time. The connection transformed Daniel from an isolated abuser into a possible link between Claire and a man who had escaped responsibility for Rebecca's death. Maya obtained a search warrant for Daniel's Connecticut apartment after tracing the prepaid phone through store footage. Police found photographs of Claire, schedules from the clinic, and printed articles about Ethan, yet Daniel himself had disappeared. More disturbing was a file containing copies of Rebecca's medical records, security routes, and personal correspondence. Claire recognized Daniel's pattern immediately because he collected private information to make people believe he understood them better than they understood themselves. During their relationship, he memorized her work schedule, passwords, and family conflicts, then presented surveillance as devotion. She realized Daniel had not chosen her accidentally. He may have approached her because she worked at a clinic connected to Ethan's foundation and believed she could provide access. The possibility poisoned Claire's memories more painfully than the physical abuse. She remembered Daniel asking casual questions about donors, clinic board members, and private patient appointments, while pretending interest in her career. Ethan listened as she described those conversations in Maya's office, but he did not reassure her with empty claims that none of it had been real. He said, manipulation could coexist with genuine affection, which often made betrayal harder to recognize rather than easier. Claire asked whether he was speaking about Daniel or Marcus, and Ethan admitted the lesson applied to both. Marcus had been his closest friend since college, the man trusted with passwords, family schedules, and every vulnerable person Ethan attempted to protect. Rebecca's death had taught Ethan to control more carefully, but not necessarily to trust more wisely. The investigation moved quickly after police found a dormant account Marcus had used to pay Daniel's contractor fees. Recent transfers from that account funded the rental sedan, prepaid phones, and a private investigator who photographed Claire outside the clinic. Maya believed Marcus wanted Ethan to react publicly, perhaps by threatening Daniel or hiding Claire somewhere private, because either action could be framed as coercion. Ethan's business rivals had recently challenged his control of a shipping consortium, and evidence portraying him as a violent man imprisoning a vulnerable woman could destroy his credibility. Claire understood the strategy immediately. Her fear was not merely personal, it was being shaped into a weapon against both of them. Maya advised Claire to relocate temporarily, but every secure residence Ethan controlled would support Marcus's intended narrative if discovered. Claire suggested staying with her colleague Jasmine, whose apartment had building security and no connection to Ethan. The decision frustrated him, although he acknowledged that safety did not require proximity to his power. Before Claire left her apartment, Ethan helped move only the items she selected and asked before opening every cabinet. The careful questions felt excessive until she recognized what he was doing. He was proving that urgency did not erase consent. When Claire found Daniel's old key hidden inside a kitchen drawer, Ethan placed it in an evidence bag rather than allowing anger to become action. At Jasmine's apartment, Claire began receiving voice recordings instead of texts. Daniel sounded calm, apologetic, and wounded, using the same gentle tone that once convinced her every injury was an exception. He said Marcus had shown him proof that Ethan arranged Rebecca's death and claimed Claire would be discarded once she stopped being useful. Maya advised saving every recording without responding, but the third message contained a detail only Claire and Daniel knew. He mentioned the night she planned to leave, when she had hidden cash inside an anatomy textbook before Daniel found it and laughed. Hearing the memory reopen shame, Claire believed she had already escaped. She nearly called him, not because she trusted him, but because a familiar danger sometimes felt easier to manage than an invisible one. Instead, Claire called Ethan and admitted she wanted to answer Daniel. Ethan did not forbid it. He asked what she hoped the call would accomplish, then listened while she acknowledged wanting Daniel to confirm that their entire relationship had not been designed. "He may tell you whatever keeps you connected," Ethan said. "The truth cannot be measured by how much it relieves you." Claire understood, yet she also realized Daniel's need for control could expose Marcus if given the right opportunity. With Maya monitoring, Claire sent a single response asking for proof that Ethan had harmed Rebecca. Daniel replied within minutes and offered a meeting at an abandoned ferry terminal, promising to bring Rebecca's original journal. The meeting was clearly dangerous, but refusing it might cause both men to disappear. Claire agreed to participate only after establishing conditions that preserved her role as witness rather than bait. At the terminal the following evening, police occupied concealed positions while Ethan remained miles away under Maya's instruction. Daniel arrived alone, carrying a leather notebook and wearing the apologetic expression Claire once mistook for remorse. He told her Marcus had protected him after the warehouse investigation and had chosen Claire because Ethan's foundation funded her clinic. Daniel claimed the abuse had never been part of the plan, then described it as something Claire provoked by threatening to expose him. The contradiction stripped away the last illusion that manipulation had replaced cruelty. When Claire asked where Marcus was, Daniel smiled toward the dark river behind her. "Closer than your police think," he said, as every light inside the terminal suddenly went out. Claire dropped to the concrete floor before the first crash echoed through the terminal, remembering Maya's instruction to move toward the eastern wall if visibility disappeared. Emergency lights should have activated within seconds, yet the building remained completely dark, proving someone had disabled the backup system before police arrived. Daniel grabbed Claire's coat, but she twisted free and shouted his location rather than wasting breath pleading. A gunshot struck metal somewhere above them, followed by officers ordering everyone to remain down. Daniel ran toward the river exit while Claire crawled behind a ticket counter and pressed both hands over her head. Through the darkness, a familiar voice called Marcus's name from the upper walkway, and Claire realized Ethan had ignored Maya's order to stay away. Backup lights flickered to life long enough to reveal Marcus standing above the terminal floor with a handgun, and Rebecca's real journal tucked beneath his arm. Ethan faced him from the opposite end of the walkway, unarmed and furious, while police moved toward both staircases. Marcus accused Ethan of sacrificing everyone around him to preserve the image of a principled businessman. He claimed Rebecca had trusted Ethan's promises, Daniel had trusted his protection, and Claire would eventually learn that every choice Ethan offered existed within boundaries he secretly controlled. Ethan did not argue about Rebecca, admitting aloud that pride had made him believe security could compensate for listening poorly. He said the failure belonged to him, but Rebecca's murder belonged to Marcus. Marcus aimed toward Ethan, forcing police to halt because Claire and several officers remained below the line of fire. Daniel emerged from behind a pillar and demanded the money Marcus had promised, exposing that he expected to disappear after delivering Claire. Marcus laughed and said Daniel had become useful only because frightened men were easy to direct when someone validated their anger. The insult broke whatever loyalty remained between them. Daniel lunged toward the stairway, and Marcus fired into the railing beside him, sending metal fragments across the floor. Claire saw the leather journal slide from Marcus's arm and land near the edge of the walkway. She shouted to Maya that the notebook contained evidence, ensuring officers understood why Marcus might risk retrieving it. Ethan moved before Marcus could recover the journal, kicking it through the railing so it dropped onto the terminal floor several yards from Claire. Marcus struck Ethan with the weapon, then grabbed his coat and forced him against the railing. Claire wanted to run toward the journal, but Daniel had already seen it and began crawling from the opposite side. For one suspended moment, the evidence Rebecca died protecting lay between Claire and the man who had broken her ribs. Daniel whispered that they could still leave together, promising Marcus would be arrested and everything could become what it was before. Claire recognized the offer as the final version of every apology he had ever made, a demand that she erase truth so he could avoid consequences. She reached the journal first and pulled it beneath her body as Daniel seized her ankle. Pain shot through her healing ribs, but Claire kicked free and shouted for officers rather than attempting to overpower him alone. Maya crossed the floor with 2 detectives and restrained Daniel while another team reached the upper walkway. Marcus struck Ethan again, yet Ethan refused to fight for the gun, while officers surrounded them. He lowered his hands and stepped backward, giving Marcus no justification to shoot. The decision forced Marcus to reveal what he wanted most. Instead of escaping, he pointed the weapon toward Claire and demanded the journal, proving that Rebecca's words mattered more than Ethan's life. Claire opened the notebook while remaining behind the concrete counter, and found several pages documenting Marcus's hidden accounts, meetings, and instructions to Rebecca's killer. One entry described Marcus's belief that Ethan's public reputation could be dismantled only by making his protection appear indistinguishable from imprisonment. Another named Daniel as a potential future asset, because his personnel file showed obsessive behavior and unauthorized access to women's records. Rebecca had discovered the plan years before Daniel ever met Claire. The relationship had begun with surveillance, but Daniel's violence remained his own choice, not an order Marcus could be blamed for creating. Claire photographed the pages and transmitted them directly to Maya's evidence server before Marcus could destroy the journal. When Marcus realized the records had been preserved, his confidence collapsed into rage. He accused Ethan of turning frightened women into symbols for his own redemption, but Claire answered before Ethan could speak. She said Ethan had made mistakes, including arriving at the terminal despite being ordered away, yet he had never demanded her silence, dependence, or gratitude. "You keep calling control protection because you cannot imagine helping someone who remains free to leave," she said. Marcus fired toward the counter, but the shot struck concrete as officers tackled him from behind. Ethan fell during the struggle and hit the lower landing, remaining motionless until paramedics reached him. Daniel continued calling Claire's name while officers led him away, alternating apologies with accusations when she refused to look at him. She felt no dramatic relief, only exhaustion, and the strange clarity that came when a person's final mask no longer mattered. Maya recovered Rebecca's journal, confirmed Claire's photographs had transmitted successfully, and accompanied her to the ambulance, where Ethan regained consciousness. His shoulder was dislocated, his face bruised, and his first question concerned whether Claire had been injured. She told him the truth. Her ribs hurt. She was terrified, and his decision to enter the terminal had violated the safety plan they agreed upon. Ethan closed his eyes, accepting the criticism without asking the crisis to excuse him. At the hospital, Claire learned Ethan had come because Marcus sent him a live image showing Daniel holding her near the river entrance. Ethan had called Maya while driving, but arrived before receiving instructions. His fear was understandable, yet Claire refused to romanticize it as proof of love. She said a relationship could not survive if his instinct to rescue repeatedly overruled her right to participate in decisions. Ethan apologized without describing himself as helpless before fear, and promised not merely to behave differently, but to seek help understanding why Rebecca's death still controlled his judgment. Claire stayed until the doctor confirmed he would recover, then went home with Jasmine rather than accepting Ethan's offer of private security. 3 days later, Maya informed Claire that Rebecca's journal, financial records, surveillance footage, and Daniel's statements supported charges against both men. Marcus faced conspiracy, evidence tampering, attempted murder, and involvement in Rebecca's death, while Daniel faced stalking, assault, unlawful surveillance, and conspiracy. The legal process would take months, perhaps years, and no verdict could return the years Rebecca lost. Claire understood that survival did not become complete simply because danger had been arrested. She began trauma counseling through a program unrelated to Ethan and requested extended medical leave from the clinic. For the first time, healing became work she chose rather than weakness she concealed. Ethan respected Claire's request for distance during the first month after the terminal, contacting her only through brief messages that required no response. He began therapy with a counselor experienced in survivor guilt and stepped away temporarily from several business decisions connected to Marcus's investigation. Claire learned these details from Maya rather than Ethan, which reassured her that his changes were not being performed for approval. She spent mornings walking beside the Charles River, afternoons attending counseling, and evenings rebuilding routines that had once revolved around avoiding Daniel's anger. Recovery felt less inspiring than people liked to imagine. Some days she felt strong enough to testify before a courtroom, while other days, an unexpected footstep behind her emptied every thought from her mind. The clinic held her position and arranged paid leave through an employee assistance fund established before Ethan joined the board. Claire initially suspected he had influenced the decision, then discovered the fund came from years of small staff donations and a grant written by her supervisor. The correction mattered because it reminded her that help did not always arrive from the most powerful person in the room. Jasmine brought dinner without asking questions. Dr. Lowe adjusted treatment when Claire's ribs became inflamed again, and Maya explained every legal update without treating confusion as incompetence. Claire began seeing safety as a network of honest relationships rather than a fortress one man could construct around her. That understanding allowed her to think about Ethan without confusing gratitude, attraction, and dependence. 6 weeks after the arrests, Claire invited him to meet at the public garden on a Saturday morning. Ethan arrived alone, wearing a sling beneath his coat and carrying no driver, assistant, or elaborate apology. He looked thinner, and the fading bruise near his temple made the terminal impossible to ignore. Claire told him she appreciated that he had respected her space, then asked what he had learned about the decision to enter the building. Ethan said he had spent years believing Rebecca died because he had not acted aggressively enough. So every new threat triggered a promise that he would never hesitate again. Therapy forced him to confront that the promise centered his fear rather than the person he claimed to protect. "I treated action as love because waiting made me feel powerless," he admitted. "That does not make the action right." Claire explained that Daniel had controlled her by presenting fear as devotion, which meant even benevolent decisions made without consent could reopen wounds Ethan did not intend to touch. He listened without defending the differences between them. When she asked whether he could remain in her life without becoming responsible for preventing every possible danger, Ethan said he wanted to learn, although wanting did not guarantee success. The honesty felt safer than a vow of perfection. Claire did not resume their relationship that morning, but she agreed to meet for coffee the following week. She made clear that affection would grow only through ordinary consistency, not shared danger. The months that followed contained no mysterious vehicles, anonymous photographs, or dramatic rescues. Ethan sometimes asked too many questions when Claire worked late, then corrected himself before concern became interrogation. Claire occasionally interpreted silence as withdrawal and practiced asking directly rather than inventing rejection. They argued about money when Ethan offered to replace her unreliable car, and he accepted her refusal without secretly arranging another solution. Claire attended several court hearings, read a victim statement describing Daniel's violence without minimizing it, and refused media requests that wanted to turn her into evidence of Ethan's goodness. Her story belonged to her, even when public curiosity preferred a simpler romance. Marcus eventually pleaded guilty after forensic evidence connected him to payments surrounding Rebecca's death. He admitted recruiting Daniel to monitor clinic donors, and later encouraging him to terrorize Claire when Ethan became involved. Daniel rejected a plea agreement until Claire's recorded meeting, and the files found in his apartment made conviction likely. During sentencing, he apologized while blaming fear, jealousy, Marcus, alcohol, and Claire's decision to leave. Claire listened without searching his face for the man she once loved. She told the court that accountability began when explanation stopped competing with responsibility. Daniel received a substantial prison sentence, and a permanent protection order remained in place. Rebecca's sister contacted Claire after the hearings and asked to meet privately. She brought photographs showing Rebecca laughing at a beach, wearing muddy hiking boots, and holding a terrible birthday cake she had baked herself. "People only talk about how she died," her sister said. "I wanted someone involved in the case to know how loudly she lived." Claire understood that Rebecca had become a lesson inside Ethan's mind, rather than a complete person, just as survivors were often reduced to their worst experiences. With permission, Claire showed Ethan one photograph and encouraged him to meet Rebecca's family only if they requested it. He wrote a letter, accepting responsibility for the failures within his company, without asking forgiveness, then left the decision entirely with them. Nearly a year after Claire walked into the rain with fractured ribs, the clinic received funding to convert an abandoned office building into a recovery center for patients facing domestic abuse, housing instability, and medical debt. Ethan's foundation contributed, but Claire required that no donor control services, admissions, or publicity. She accepted the role of program director only after negotiating salary, authority, staffing, and independent oversight. The woman who once believed needing help would allow others to judge whether her pain mattered now built systems ensuring nobody had to earn belief through visible damage. On opening morning, Claire stood before the entrance with her speech folded inside her coat and saw Ethan waiting near the back of the crowd. He did not approach until she crossed the room toward him. Claire's speech avoided the language of rescue because she had learned how easily that word turned complex lives into simple stories. She spoke instead about choices, including the decision to ask for help, the decision to believe someone, and the decision to keep offering dignity when fear made control seem more efficient. Families, nurses, counselors, volunteers, and neighborhood residents filled the center's sunlit lobby, while children decorated paper doors with words describing what safety meant to them. Some wrote home, others wrote quiet, and one little girl wrote a place where nobody checks my phone. Claire paused beside that card longer than the others, remembering how Daniel once demanded passwords while insisting secrecy was proof of betrayal. The center would provide legal advocacy, temporary housing referrals, medical care, employment counseling, and support without requiring anyone to surrender authority over personal decisions. Ethan stood near Rebecca's sister during the ceremony, maintaining a respectful distance that revealed more growth than any public declaration could have done. Their meeting had occurred privately months earlier, and neither discussed its details with Claire beyond saying they had chosen honesty over comfort. A bronze plaque thanked community donors collectively, listing no wealthy benefactor above the nurses, construction workers, local businesses, and former patients who contributed. Ethan had initially objected only because he thought Rebecca's name should appear, but her family declined to turn the center into a memorial. Instead, they funded a small library carrying books Rebecca loved, allowing visitors to encounter part of her life untouched by violence. Claire placed Ethan's leather compass bookmark inside the first donated novel, not as a symbol that someone had directed her, but as evidence that losing direction had never erased her ability to choose again. After the crowd thinned, Ethan joined Claire beside a window overlooking the neighborhood. He congratulated her without saying he was proud, because he understood pride could sound possessive when offered by someone who had not done the work. Claire teased him for examining every sentence before speaking, and he admitted therapy had made spontaneous conversation unexpectedly complicated. Their laughter felt ordinary, which had become more valuable than intensity. Ethan asked whether she wanted dinner after the final volunteers left, then added that declining would not disappoint him. Claire accepted, but only after making him help carry boxes to the supply room like everyone else. They walked through Boston beneath a clear evening sky, passing the corner where rain had first folded Claire toward the pavement. She stopped beneath the awning and remembered the woman who believed privacy was the only protection available to her. Ethan remained beside her, without reaching out, allowing the memory to exist without rushing it toward a happier meaning. Claire told him that meeting him had changed her life, yet she no longer believed he had saved it. She had left Daniel before Ethan knew her name, protected evidence while Marcus threatened her, testified in court, accepted treatment, and built a future through choices nobody else could make. Ethan agreed, saying the distinction mattered because love should recognize strength rather than claim authorship of it. Claire asked whether he regretted stopping that night, considering everything that followed. Ethan answered that regret belonged to the ways he sometimes allowed fear to override respect, not to noticing someone in pain. He said meeting Claire forced him to understand that protection without consent could become another expression of control, even when intention remained kind. She admitted that trusting him required learning another difficult truth. Independence did not mean refusing every hand offered in good faith. They had both mistaken isolation for strength in different ways. Their relationship endured because neither person was asked to disappear inside the other's healing. 2 years later, the recovery center expanded into the adjoining building and trained clinics across Massachusetts to recognize signs of coercive control without pressuring patients to disclose before they felt ready. Claire became known for asking practical questions instead of delivering inspirational speeches, because stable housing, confidential communication, and paid medical leave often changed lives more effectively than beautiful advice. She continued counseling and occasionally woke from dreams in which Daniel stood outside her apartment, yet fear no longer convinced her that recovery had failed. Ethan maintained therapy, reorganized his companies around independent accountability, and sold the warehouse division Marcus once controlled. He did not abandon power, but he stopped confusing secrecy with leadership. Their love grew through details nobody would place in a newspaper. Ethan learned not to replace Claire's chipped coffee mug, even when the handle threatened to fall off, because she wanted to repair it herself. Claire learned that his silence sometimes meant reflection rather than concealed anger, although she still asked when uncertainty became uncomfortable. They spent autumn weekends in Vermont with his grandparents' old neighbors, argued about directions despite owning 3 navigation devices, and discovered neither of them could bake bread properly. When Ethan eventually proposed beside the Charles River, he did not produce a crowd, photographer, or speech promising permanent protection. He asked whether Claire wanted to build a life where both of them could remain fully themselves. Claire said yes, after reminding him that marriage did not transfer ownership of decisions, passwords, friendships, work, or fear. Ethan answered that he would expect her to leave the room if he ever forgot, then return only if conversation remained safe. She laughed before accepting the ring, not because the subject lacked seriousness, but because honesty had become intimate rather than frightening. Rebecca's sister attended their small wedding, as did Maya, Dr. Lowe, Jasmine, and several clinic co-workers who had once believed Claire's careful movements came only from exhaustion. No one described Ethan as the man who rescued her. He was the man who learned to stand beside her without stepping in front of her life. Years afterward, Claire sometimes told new staff members about the rainy evening when a stranger noticed she could not breathe without pain. She never mentioned his wealth first, because money had been the least important thing Ethan offered. He noticed, asked, stepped back, made mistakes, accepted correction, and stayed long enough for trust to become something built rather than demanded. Claire's deepest lesson was not that the right person could erase what the wrong person had done. It was that love became safe when nobody's fear was permitted to overrule another person's freedom. The future had never belonged to Daniel, Marcus, Ethan, or the injuries hidden beneath her clothes. It belonged to Claire from the moment she chose to leave, and every loving hand afterward mattered because it helped her remember what had always been true.